Hello, I'm Dr. Terry Susan Fine, Content Specialist for the Florida Joint Center for Citizenship, which is part of the School of Politics, Security, and International Affairs at the University of Central Florida in Orlando. Welcome to our Middle School Civics Highlights series. Today we look at benchmark CG.3.3. Describe the structure and function of the three branches of government established in the U.S. Constitution. In Part 1, we focus on recognizing the structure of the legislative, executive, and judicial branches. What is the structure of the legislative, executive, and judicial branches of government in the United States? We're going to be focusing our attention on this graphic. In this information graphic, we see in essence three layers, and we also see three vertical parts. And we'll be focusing our attention on both the layers and the parts. Note that at the very top, it is the United States Constitution that is in charge, that oversees, that rules all three branches of government. So no matter if we're focusing on the legislative branch, the executive branch, or the judicial branch, each of those individually is overseen and governed by the United States Constitution. Next, we take a look at the legislative branch. That is the branch on the left side. Note that the presentation of the three branches of government, beginning with the legislative branch, then going to the executive branch, then going to the judicial branch, are treated as three co-equal branches of government. Now, certainly there are questions among political science scholars and legal scholars as to whether or not there are three co-equal branches of government. And certainly these questions have merit, they have value. After all, if we know that the legislative branch is responsible for making laws and the executive branch is responsible for enforcing laws and the judiciary branch is responsible for interpreting the meaning of those laws and also now has the power to decide whether a law that was made in accordance to the constitutional lawmaking process is consistent with the principles of the Constitution, that is a power that is held by the judiciary branch. So it's an interesting question as to whether or not these are three co-equal branches. Let's think about this. The legislative branch makes the laws, and the president is responsible for enforcing them. But what if the legislative branch decides against making a law that the president wants the legislative branch to make? Who is more powerful in this scenario? Is it Congress that has more power because they can, in essence, deny the president what the president wants? Or are they truly equal? Similarly, the president might sign something called an executive order. And with an executive order, the president is telling the bureaucracy how the president wants a law to be enforced. And the way that the president wants a law to be enforced might be inconsistent with what the legislature believes is within their power. And it may happen that the judicial branch decides that an executive order that was written by the president and signed by the president, of course, might be something that was outside the president's power and instead should be taken up by Congress, even if Congress doesn't want to. So it's always an interesting question. Are the three branches of government co-equal, Or is the legislative branch more powerful than the executive or the judiciary branches because the legislative branch decides if they will even enact a law that the president wants? The U.S. Senate, which is part of the legislative branch, they decide whether or not to confirm a member of the United States Supreme Court. And while there's no answer to this question, it's certainly a good question to ask. So looking across from left to right, we see a presentation of three branches, similar in size, all on the same level, but we also know that we have questions as to whether or not they are truly co-equal. Now we go to the third level of this information graphic, and we see that there are two chambers of the legislative branch. So if we go back up just one level, we see that there's a central dome that connects the two chambers. And so this is symbolic. This tells us that the two chambers, they are separate and distinct from one another, but they are also part of a greater whole, and that greater whole is the legislative branch. Now we go back down to the third or lowest level of the information graphic, and we see that there are two chambers of the legislative branch. There are some powers that are shared by both chambers, and there are some powers that are unique to each chamber. So they are equal in how they are presented here, but they are also different in meaningful ways. So the House of Representatives has the sole power to impeach federal officials, but the U.S. Senate has the sole power to ratify treaties that are negotiated by the president, and also has the sole power to confirm nominations such as ambassadors, cabinet officials, and U.S. Supreme Court justices. And so between these two, what we see is that there are two chambers represented as equal in size, and they do share some powers such as lawmaking, but they are not equal in terms of the types of powers that they each hold exclusively. Now let's move one to the right, and we see the executive branch, which is headed by the President of the United States, but we also see moving down that arrow that the President has a cabinet. A cabinet member is a person who most often is responsible for a department, for a federal department, such as the Department of Justice or the Department of Education. But there are some people in the President's cabinet who are not responsible for overseeing an entire department, but nonetheless might play a role that is significant enough that the president invites them to join the cabinet, such as the director of certain agencies like the Environmental Protection Agency. And then within the judicial branch includes 9 members of the United States Supreme Court, and it also includes circuit courts of appeals and district courts. And so there are several districts across the United States, there are several circuits across the United States, but the highest court in the land is the United States Supreme Court. And so we see from this information graphic how we have the Constitution overseeing everything. We have 3 branches of government where some say are co-equal, some say are not, and then we see also some unique characteristics of each branch, such as the legislative branch including 2 chambers, such as the executive branch including a cabinet, and the judicial branch including the highest court in the land, the United States Supreme Court. Thank you for joining me for Middle School Civics Highlights. Do you still have questions? If so, please contact us using the information that appears on the screen. Till next time, I'm Dr. Terry Susan Fine. Thank you for joining me.